Hurricane Florence.
Now, I've lived here 20.
Flooding from Hurricane Florence.
Now, I've lived here 20 years, and the worst I've ever seen.
Lives lost. Hundreds of thousands without power.
It's just loud, wet. Lost pretty much everything in the back of the house.
So many being rescued.
I think a lot of people thought that they could ride it out. Didn't realize how high the rivers would come.
And the worst may be yet to come. This morning, I'll talk to FEMA Administrator Brock Long and the mayor of hard-hit New Bern, North Carolina. Plus, Manafort flips. President Trump's one-time campaign chief pleads guilty and agrees to cooperate with Robert Mueller.
Tough day for Mr. Manafort, but he's accepted responsibility.
Candidate Trump brought Manafort in to rescue his nomination.
Paul Manafort has done an amazing job.
And it praised him for not making a plea deal.
His whole thing about flipping, they call it, it almost ought to be outlawed.
What could Manafort tell prosecutors about the Trump Tower meeting? What does he know about the campaign's Russia connections? And could President Trump still pardon him? My guest this morning, the leading Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, and Professor Emeritus at Harvard Law School, Alan Dershowitz. Joining me for insight and analysis are presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, Rich Lowry, editor of National Review, Wall Street Journal columnist Peggy Noonan, and Yamiche Alcindor, White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. Welcome to Sunday. It's Meet the Press.
From NBC News in Washington, the longest-running show in television history. This is Meet the Press with Chuck Todd.
Good Sunday morning. We have two huge stories this morning. The flooding from Hurricane Florence, what FEMA calls a Mike Tyson punch to the Carolina coast, and Paul Manafort's decision to plead guilty and, more importantly, to cooperate with the special counsel. We'll get to Manafort in a moment. But first, Hurricane Florence has weakened to a tropical depression. It's creeping inland. But as the winds die down, record-setting rains continue to fall, up to 30 inches already in parts of North Carolina. And the big threat is now catastrophic flooding, which could be days long. The storm is already responsible for more than a dozen deaths. More than 700,000 people in the two Carolinas remain without power, and tens of thousands of people are staying in shelters, schools, churches, even Wake Forest's basketball arena is serving as a shelter. More than 13,000 Defense Department personnel are supporting FEMA, and 1,200 federal urban search and rescue personnel have been deployed. Multiple stretches of I-95 are closed, and across North Carolina, rescues are still underway by air and by boat. And in New Bern, more than 450 residents have been rescued after more than 10 feet of storm surge.
I'm going right back first. I need help with this guy. Hey guys, can I have a little help?
It was horrifying. Just wondering what's going on and where the water's going to go.
Now, I've lived here 20 years, and the worst I've ever seen.
And joining me now is the mayor of New Bern, North Carolina, Dana Outlaw. Mr. Mayor, welcome to Meet the Press, sir.
Good morning.
Well, look, let's start with the good news. Yesterday, you announced on the city website that all water rescues have been completed. How out of the woods is New Bern? How concerned are you about return flooding, if you will?
We're very concerned. A lot of the creeks around New Bern are increasing by the hour. We have some folks that their yards are starting to get water because of the tremendous amount of rainfall from the other eastern parts of North Carolina that is coming into New Bern now by Trent River, Bryce's Creek, Neuse River.
What is it that residents need to prepare for? You know, on one hand, they think, oh, all the water rescues are done. The water is starting to recede. Is it next week that you're concerned that all of a sudden this sort of comes back?
We're very concerned right now about trees that are continuing to fall down because of the saturated ground conditions. And so at this time, we're urging residents to stay inside and to not travel. We have a curfew in New Bern at this time. We have 30 roads in New Bern right now that are still not passable. We have 4,200 homes in New Bern that have been damaged, some extensively. We have over 300 commercial buildings in New Bern that are damaged. So, and right now we have 6,000 customers in New Bern alone without power. So again, we're trying hard to get this power restored. So we've actually had to kind of go to the downtown area and close it off because of the number of folks that are just wanting to get out and ride around, and we're trying to get these power lines up. So please, don't get in the way of our electrical linemen as they do their job.
You have an opportunity here to speak to Washington, so I'm going to give you that opportunity. What do you need? How do you want the federal response to help New Bern?
President Trump called yesterday, and I thanked him for having immediately declared a declaration emergency. And in turn, Governor Cooper has given us those resources to get underway the recovery process. So right now we are setting up a coordinator to assist us with FEMA and getting all the resources, the water, the food, and the temporary housing. We have 1,200 residents in shelters right now. And so at this time, again, the major concern is the power line restoration, getting the power back to our customers, and keeping folks off of the streets so that we can restore the power. When you're riding around, you're keeping somebody from getting their power back on. Please don't do that. And anybody that wants to help, a lot of groups are coming in, the Firemen's Association, and different groups, Keller Williams, and all these groups are coming into New Bern. So we're staging that as we speak. We have a big stage area for 18-wheelers. We're working on a center in New Bern, the Omega Center, to drop off individual food and water and other things.
Well, it sounds like you've got a pretty well-coordinated response on the ground there, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, I appreciate you taking a few minutes to talk with us. I know you have to get back and run your response. So good luck to everybody in New Bern.
Thank you so much.
You got it.
Thank you.
Joining me now is FEMA Administrator Brock Long. Mr. Long, welcome back to Meet the Press.
How you doing, Chuck?
Let me just start with what you can tell us this morning. We know that this is a water event. There's a lot of flooding issues you're dealing with. I know you anticipated catastrophic flooding. Is it as anticipated? Are there areas that it's worse than you expected? Are there areas that it's better than expected?
Well, unfortunately, the event is still unfolding for the next 48 hours. The National Hurricane Center did a phenomenal job of letting people know nearly a week in advance of what was coming, and everything that they've been predicting, the storm surge, the ocean rising, the coastal flood inundation was realized. You saw the ocean rise anywhere from 9 to 11 feet, causing a lot of damage along the coast and in the Back Bay and inlet areas of the Pamlico Sound. And now what you're seeing is we're seeing actual rainfall in 30 inches or more in some areas. I think Swansboro, North Carolina's got 30 inches. So we're seeing damage very, as predicted, unfortunately.
What is your biggest need right now? What are the biggest needs down there right now?
Well, right now we're focused on life safety, search and rescue. Our urban search and rescue teams, we pre-positioned, I think, over 27 different teams. Like 1,300 people in the field doing search and rescue, supporting our state, local capabilities, from the National Guard to local swiftwater rescues. They performed several hundred evacuations and rescues in isolated areas. And I think what we're about to see, because of the inland flooding and roadways going underwater, we're going to be able to have to service people in isolated areas that are surrounded by floodwaters. And then it's always a difficult life sustainment mission. People are displaced, they're in a shelter. We just need to make sure that we're meeting the demands of taking care of people in those shelters. But right now, you've got a strong Governor, Roy Cooper, in North Carolina, a strong Division of Emergency Management Director in Mike Sprayberry, and we're meeting their demands as they're coming up to us, and we'll get through this. It'll be ugly, but we'll get through it. I mean, recovery is always a very frustrating process for people when they've lost their livelihood, but we're going to be okay.
Obviously, it takes a little bit longer to start recovery efforts when you have a flooding situation. That was what happened in Houston with Harvey. How long do you expect this flooding event to basically hamper your ability to do some of the biggest part of the disaster recovery?
Well, we have to wait for the hazardous elements associated with the storm to exit the area before we can actually send our people in. We never want to put our own people in harm's way. The frustrating thing about an inland flood like this in North Carolina or South Carolina as well is that you got to wait for the water to recede in some cases to get people back in or to fix infrastructure. And as you've seen, you've got major roadway corridors like I-40 and I-95 being compromised in some areas or underwater. And, we have to do things like figure out other logistical routes to get supplies in to those that were impacted on the coast now that they're, the threat is diminishing and moving inland.
As your preparation began, a reporter asked a simple question about what lessons were learned from Puerto Rico.
Sure.
And the president went off and sort of didn't accept the premise that there were lessons to be learned from Puerto Rico. Were there lessons to be learned from Puerto Rico for you, sir?
Yeah, I don't believe the president. I think the president's being taken out of context there. I mean, I talk to the president every day this week, and the Secretary of Homeland Security. We discuss what we're trying to do as a result of last year. He's well aware of that. And the thing about Puerto Rico is that disaster response and recovery it's a whole community team effort. You have to have anybody from neighbor helping neighbor like the Cajun Navy all the way up to the federal government response. And I always say that emergency management is like a chair with four legs. One leg represents the federal government. The other leg represents the state and local government. The third leg represents the private sector and NGOs. And the private sector owns 85% of the infrastructure in this country. And then the fourth leg is you, the citizen. So anytime that there is one leg missing going into a response and recovery.
Which leg was missing in Puerto Rico?
Well, let's face it. FEMA, I'll be honest. I mean, FEMA was the first responder and the only responder for many weeks going into Puerto Rico. So here's what we're doing to change that. We're working with Governor Rosselló. He, like me, just came into his job, right, and gets hit with one of the most complex disasters. I work with Governor Rosselló and his staff every day to say, hey, how do we build a stronger emergency management capability in the Commonwealth and at the 78 municipality level? And not only have we hired 1,800? FEMA's now one of the largest employers in Puerto Rico. I got the best of what Puerto Rico's got to offer. I've got teachers, doctors, lawyers, engineers that are now part of FEMA helping the Commonwealth to design a more viable and economic future going forward.
The president has been disputing the death toll, multiple tweets. He said over many months it went to 64 people, then like magic, 3,000 people killed. Believe it or not, Mr. Long, the White House put out a 5-page backgrounder citing other death toll numbers that were less than the one that the governor of Puerto Rico has accepted. 2,975 people died as a result of Hurricane Maria or impact from Hurricane Maria, according to the Puerto Rican government. Does FEMA accept that number?
So the numbers are all over the place. FEMA doesn't count deaths. And like if you take what's going on with Florence, the deaths that are verified by the local county coroners are the ones that we take. Now, what we do offer are funeral benefits after a disaster for those that are eligible. And so those are some of the numbers that you can put forward that can be cross-referenced with any of the numbers that are out there. But here's the thing. These guys are so dedicated. They work around the clock. One death is a death too many.
But why does it matter? Why is the White House so concerned about the difference between 3,000 deaths and, say, another report that might have had it at 1,800 deaths? I mean, you've said yourself it doesn't matter, but the White House believes it matters. Why?
Well, I'll tell you this. One thing about President Trump is that he is probably the one president that has had more support for what goes on back here. And I think he's defensive because he knows how hard these guys behind me work day in and day out for a very complex situation. And it's frustrating. Those studies, the Harvard study was done differently than the George Washington study or this study or that study. And the numbers are all over the place. And where the 65... Hold on.
Is it fair? I mean, he said Democrats did it to make him look bad. Do you believe any of these studies were done to make the president look bad?
Well, I mean, I don't think the studies... I don't know why the studies were done. I mean, I think what we're trying to do, in my opinion, what we've got to do is figure out why people die from direct deaths, which is the wind, the water, and the waves, buildings collapsing, which is probably where the 65 number came from. And then there's indirect deaths. So the George Washington study looked at what happens 6 months after the fact. And, what happens is, and even in this event, you might see more deaths indirectly occur as time goes on because people have heart attacks due to stress. They fall off their house trying to fix their roof. They die in car crashes because they went through an intersection where the stoplights weren't working. The other thing that goes on, there's all kinds of studies on this that we take a look at. Spousal abuse goes through the roof. You can't blame spousal abuse, after a disaster on anybody. And the president's very passionate about the work we've done. He's been incredibly supportive of me and the staff. I bet he's probably the only president that's held 2 cabinet-level meetings, brought his entire cabinet to this agency.